Some years before this whole Dr. Pennsylvania thing started, I thought a lot about doing it. There were these long drives along Route 62, hugging the Allegheny River and plunging through the misty dawn, while little lights flickered in the kitchen windows of the scattered houses and villages I passed on my way to Warren. In the homes, coffee makers boiling, radio broadcast news, and voices silently cursed the brisk dawning of another workday. There are times when the forest seemed vast and the towns small, and like you could take the whole of it and wrap it around yourself. From the time I was in 3rd grade, I always fantasized about living in an adamantine teardrop ship the size of a football, floating around watching the world, maybe living in a submarine in Lake Erie. On those drives up Route 62, on those drives down 66, down Route 6, up 8, on those drives, and I still drive a lot for work, but this was a particularly special time early on when all these towns that I passed were new to me, and they were exciting. They were akin to trekking through remote outposts in the wilderness. On those drives, my Grand Prix was an indestructible fortress periodically in need of an oil change. The red glow from the dash was a series of instruments by which I could measure time. I would imagine myself speaking to Pennsylvania from a snowy window overlooking a bustling street in the big towns, big in the western Pennsylvania scale, telling stories, holding out against time. Sometimes I live my life inside a model railroad display, an ideal town of autumn hills, trout streams, trucks with torpedo fenders. And just atop the hill looking down the main drag stands the Radio Shack, the eyes of the model world. It's all silly. It really is. But you should remember that your most private thoughts, the ones that embarrass or scare you the most, those thoughts are the most universal. Your private thoughts are the most universal. Time. I remember when I first felt the sense of getting older, of time and transition. I was 21, living in Meadville, and working at the library. When I was a kid, there were Boxcar Children and Babysitters Club book series. Most importantly for me, there was the Alvin Schwartz and Stephen Gamel's controversial folklore collections. Sometimes you forget how weird the 1980s were, with Satan looming around every corner and kids reading was something to be feared. They were the paperbacks that had worn a bit with age. Those Boxcar Children, the more scary stories, they were weather-worn, just past their prime. But when I was in school, there were other series that were coming out that were the new books. There was the Goosebumps and whatnot. Books that I recall being fresh and starred new in the scholastic order forms. When I worked at the library at 21, these were now the well-worn, occasionally frayed books just past their prime, which were frequented by literate kids and frequently reshelved by sappy nostalgia-bitten college students. The world around me tallied a step. They say the sense of smell is most closely linked to memory, or something like that. I'm not sure, but I remember being in St. Michael's in Cambria County and smelling something familiar, something like an autumn gray. I stuck my nose in the air walking around the town without any real aim, killing time before a meeting and ignoring lunch, smelling the air, and it hit me. Coal smoke. Somewhere in Cambria County there is a house still heating with coal. And that probably isn't that uncommon, but I'd nearly forgotten that scent, which at one point was so much in the air that I didn't know a cold month not to smell that way. I was also too young to make the connection to coal at that time. Go figure. Walking through Clearfield on the west side of town near the football stadium, I smelled in the spring air a kitchen smell which I associated with old women and pine wood paneling. I don't know what food smells like that, but I'd smelled it before many times, time enough to know that it is a dying smell, a smell of a generation cooking a generation's food which was being replaced by giant plastic bags of one skillet noodle dishes. The closest meal I've ever had to that smell was purchased last spring in the Texas Hot and Cane, PA. Chicken and biscuits with mashed potatoes. I ate it in my warm car before hitting the road to Ridgeway. When I left my meeting in Ridgeway, I stepped back into my car. It was still warm from the sun, and I walked into a matronly kitchen, akin to the one I'd walked past somewhere on a side street in Clearfield. Maybe that smell was a casserole. That's not the type of food I grew up eating, but they seem to be regulated to Midwest women's meal plan arsenal. Or maybe it was just chicken and biscuits. None of it matters so much. The only thing that seems to matter to me is to catch the memories of yesterday before they forever disappear. The roadside diner, motel, the payphone, even the lonely cigarette machine. I've said before in another episode that I feel like I'm always saying goodbye to things that are passing. The color of light, the way the sun seems softer in your memory, disappearing sounds, the weather-beaten wooded fences of small-town America. Our swatch of Appalachia is as close to living within the model railroad set as anything ever was. So, I suppose this ramble is a little more than the self-realization that all the histories, mythologies, mysteries, and whatnot are really my way of living my daydreams, wrapping the land around me like a quilt, and keeping warm within it.